The courtroom was supposed to be a place of solemnity, where grief was met with respect and justice was the only language spoken. But when a teenage killer faced Judge Judy and the shattered family of his victim, he did the unthinkable. He laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, not a slip of emotion, but a deliberate, arrogant laugh that echoed through the chamber, slicing through a mother's tears like a blade. To him, their pain was a performance, and he was the star of the show. What no one in that moment realized, however, was that this very arrogance would be the spark that lit the path to his downfall. Because while he thought he had fooled the court, there was someone sitting quietly in the shadows, his own sister, carrying a truth so devastating it would unravel everything he had built and strip away the mask he thought could never be broken. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of how unchecked arrogance meets its reckoning, and how betrayal from within can expose a monster to the light. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and comment the word justice if you believe no amount of arrogance can silence the truth. The stakes in Judge Judy's courtroom were unlike anything she had faced in her long career. This wasn't a minor civil dispute or even a heated argument between bitter rivals. This was a matter of life and death, of truth versus lies, of whether a grieving family would ever see justice delivered for the daughter they had lost. The air itself felt heavy, as if the entire room understood that the outcome of this trial would ripple far beyond its four walls. The teen killer who sat smirking at the defense table wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to keep his mask intact, the carefully constructed image of a misunderstood boy rather than the cold predator he truly was. If his deception held, then the world would never know the full horror of his crime, and the family of the victim would be forced to live with the unbearable reality that their daughter's life had been reduced to nothing more than another of his manipulations. For the victim's family, the stakes were painfully clear. They had endured the sleepless nights, the endless news coverage, the cruel whispers in the community about whether their daughter had somehow brought this tragedy upon herself. And now, sitting only feet away from the one who had taken her life, they could feel his contempt radiating toward them. Every arrogant glance, every mocking laugh was a reminder that he believed he was untouchable, that their pain only fueled his ego. If the court allowed him to walk free, it wouldn't just be a failure of justice, it would be the ultimate insult. A declaration that arrogance and deceit could triumph over truth and grief. But the stakes weren't confined to the victim's family alone. They extended to the very credibility of the justice system itself. Judge Judy, a woman known for her sharp wit and her refusal to be deceived, now found herself staring into the hollow eyes of a killer who had already mocked her authority before the trial even truly began. If he managed to manipulate the courtroom and escape the consequences of his actions, it wouldn't just embolden him. It would send a chilling message to every predator watching. That charm, arrogance, and shameless lies could overpower even the most determined pursuit of justice. The courtroom wasn't just on trial. The integrity of justice itself was being tested. And then there were the silent victims who hadn't yet been counted. Because this wasn't just about one life stolen. It was about the lives he might steal if he were allowed to walk away. His arrogance wasn't a mask he wore temporarily. It was the very fuel that drove him. Behind his smirk and his rehearsed innocence was a hunger for power, for control, for proving that he could outsmart everyone in the room. If he succeeded here, who would he target next? Another friend? Another trusting partner? Another family that would be left shattered in his wake? The stakes weren't just about one family's loss. They were about preventing the creation of more families with the same unhealed wound. Even his own sister understood the gravity of what hung in the balance. She sat in silence then, her lips pressed tightly together, carrying a secret that burned in her chest. She knew what he had told her. She knew the words he had spoken in the dark, the twisted pride with which he had described what he had done. If she stayed silent, she would be complicit. If she spoke, she would betray her blood. And so she sat at the edge of her own breaking point. The stakes for her perhaps the highest of all. She was trapped between loyalty to her family and the crushing moral weight of truth. She knew the courtroom would one day turn to her, and she would have to decide whether to remain a silent witness to evil or to become its destroyer. For the jury, The stakes carried a different kind of weight. 12 ordinary people had been called to decide a case that was anything but ordinary. They had to look past the polished facade of a teenage boy and see the monster underneath. They had to hold fast against the manipulations, the lies, and the theatrics that would no doubt come from the defense table. The decision they made would not only determine his fate, but would stand as a reflection of their city's values, whether arrogance and cruelty could ever outweigh compassion and justice. Each juror carried not just the responsibility of law, but the heavy burden of knowing their verdict would echo in history as either justice delivered or justice denied. This was the stage Judge Judy presided over, a battle not just of legal arguments, but of moral reckoning. The teen killer believed he could laugh his way through grief, sneer at the pain of those who mourned, and still walk away, as if nothing had happened. But the stakes made it clear that this wasn't a game. His arrogance wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. If unchecked, it threatened to corrode everything the courtroom stood for. And while he sat basking in his own ego, convinced of his own invincibility, the truth was already gathering like a storm on the horizon. The stakes were not just high, they were absolute, because in the end this case wasn't about whether he would face punishment. It was about whether arrogance could ever truly escape accountability. It was about whether a courtroom full of grief could be mocked into silence, or whether that silence would be broken by the one voice he never expected in his sister's. What seemed hidden at the start was already pressing against the walls, waiting for the right moment to explode. The stakes were written into every heartbeat of that courtroom. The family's need for closure, the jury's search for truth, the judge's fight for justice, and the sister's unbearable secret. All of it converged into a single inescapable question. When arrogance and truth collide, which will survive? Long before the teenager sat smirking in Judge Judy's courtroom, the story began in the shadows of a friendship built on lies. The victim, a bright and trusting young woman, had believed she was standing shoulder to shoulder with someone who shared her dreams. She was ambitious, compassionate, and full of a quiet determination to make her small successes grow into something larger. To her, loyalty was not optional, it was sacred. Yet loyalty was the very thing her so-called partner had learned to weaponize. The killer was only 17, but arrogance had aged him into something darker. He wasn't satisfied with being a student, a friend, or even a partner in their venture. He wanted control, and he wanted it quickly. He dressed better than his peers, spoke with an ease that felt rehearsed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who thought rules were for other people. To those who met him casually, he seemed charming. But to those who watched closely, there was something hollow in his eyes, a sense that every smile was calculated, every word delivered like a sales pitch. The victim's family remembered how she defended him even when neighbors raised questions. She had poured her time, her money, and her trust into building a dream with him. Whenever his expenses looked suspicious, he had a ready excuse. Whenever she asked to review their accounts, he turned evasive, telling her not to worry, telling her he had it under control. And because she loved the idea of building something together, she accepted the lies. What she couldn't see, what no one could see then, was that the lies weren't a side effect. They were the foundation. By the time her family realized something was wrong, it was too late. Days passed without her answering calls. At first, they assumed she was busy preparing for the next big presentation she had mentioned with pride. But when her father finally used the spare key to step into her small row house, the truth revealed itself with a cold finality. She hadn't been busy. She hadn't been distracted. She had been silenced. The scene inside wasn't one of chaos, but of precision. No overturned furniture, no desperate struggle, just the chilling neatness of calculated violence. It was the killer himself who called the police, his voice carrying the perfect tone of a friend in panic. He told them he was worried, that he had been trying to reach her, that he feared something terrible had happened. To the untrained ear, it sounded like concern. To the seasoned detectives who arrived, it sounded rehearsed. There was something too steady in his tone, too measured in his grief, and while cameras outside captured him wiping fake tears from his face inside, investigators were already whispering doubts. Detective after detective noted the same detail. He seemed too ready with explanations, too quick to redirect suspicion. When asked about her finances, he suggested she had been hiding debts. When asked about their work, he claimed she had been struggling under the pressure. He painted her as unstable, planting seeds of doubt even as her family wept in disbelief. But the family knew her better. They came forward with messages, emails, and journals where she had confided her worries. Not about her own weakness, but about his spending habits, his evasiveness, and his strange new arrogance. She had been preparing to confront him. She had been preparing to expose him. And that confrontation never came because he had silenced her first. In Philadelphia, a city built on grit and blunt honesty, word spread quickly. People knew the girl, kind, thoughtful, a volunteer at the animal shelter, a neighbor who remembered birthdays. They knew the boy too, but in a different way. His car was too expensive for his age. His clothes felt out of place among working-class families. His charm didn't feel earned. It felt forced. Soon whispers turned to suspicion. The smirk he wore in public wasn't the mask of grief. It was the mask of a predator who believed he could outtalk the truth. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the picture became. The company's bank accounts were nearly drained. Withdrawals had been made in small, careful amounts over months, like a parasite feeding unnoticed. Forged signatures appeared on credit applications. Lavish purchases appeared under her name, while he played the role of the broke student. He had siphoned her resources until there was nothing left but the final obstacle, her realization. And when she was ready to confront him, he decided to erase her completely. By the time the arrest came, the arrogance was no longer hidden. Neighbors saw him led from his parents' home, hands cuffed but head held high as if he were a celebrity taking his place on stage. Reporters noted his calmness. Detectives noted his lack of surprise. It wasn't the demeanor of an innocent boy wrongly accused. It was the demeanor of someone who had already rehearsed this moment in his head, who believed he could still spin the story to his advantage. That's why the trial was never just about one life lost. It was about exposing a pattern of deception so cold that it redefined what arrogance could look like in human form. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a tragic mistake. This was calculation, greed, and the complete absence of remorse. Judge Judy knew it. The jurors could feel it. And the family who sat just a few feet away felt it with every arrogant glance he threw in their direction. Yet even as evidence mounted, as financial records piled up, and as witnesses dismantled his polished lies, he never broke. He never confessed. He never even flinched. Instead, he smiled, corrected detectives' grammar during questioning, and rolled his eyes when prosecutors spoke. In his mind, he was still in control, still above everyone else. What he could not see, what remained hidden from him until the very end, was that his greatest weakness sat in silence on the other side of the courtroom. His sister. She carried the truth he thought no one would ever reveal, and when she finally broke her silence, it would not only crush his arrogance but expose him for what he truly was, a hollow predator who mistook cruelty for power. The crime and its cover-up had laid the stage. The lies, the arrogance, and the precision of his deception had shaped the narrative. But the storm had only begun, and when arrogance collides with truth, one always shatters. The courtroom had seen arrogance before, but never like this. From the moment the trial began under Judge Judy's stern gaze, the teenager acted as though the entire proceeding was beneath him. He leaned back in his chair with an ease that was unsettling, flashing smirks not at his defense attorney or the judge, but at the grieving family sitting only feet away. Every time the victim's mother spoke, his eyes rolled dramatically. When her father described the pain of burying his only daughter, the boy stifled a laugh, shaking his head as if their suffering was nothing more than a tedious inconvenience. Judge Judy, known for her sharp tongue and unwavering command of her courtroom, caught every gesture. She warned him once, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, but the smirk never disappeared. His arrogance had gone from quiet confidence to an open performance. He wanted them to see him laugh. He wanted them to feel mocked. And with every mocking grin, he tested the patience of the court and the endurance of the family who had already lost everything. The jury, at first hesitant to show emotion, began to notice too. A man who could sneer at a mother's tears was no misunderstood teenager. He was something colder, something crueler. Each arrogant movement of his hands, each exaggerated sigh when evidence was read aloud, became another piece of proof, not of his innocence, but of his guilt. It was as if he couldn't help himself, as if mocking pain was his only true language. His defense attorney tried to rein him in, whispering urgently at the table, but the teenager brushed him off with the same smug indifference. He corrected the lawyer mid-sentence, chuckled under his breath when prosecutors laid out evidence, and even leaned toward a bailiff once to make a sarcastic remark loud enough for those nearby to hear. He wasn't just defending himself. He was performing for himself. Every action screamed that he believed he was untouchable, but arrogance has a way of turning strength into weakness. What he didn't know, what was waiting in the wings, was that the very performance he enjoyed so much was sealing his fate. Judge Judy, unwavering, kept her composure, but every note she took, every hard glance she gave, made clear that she was documenting his contempt. The jury was no longer just evaluating evidence, they were evaluating character. And his character, laid bare in every cruel laugh, was destroying him more effectively than any witness could. The family sat in silence, clutching tissues, their grief compounded by his mockery. Yet beneath their pain was a quiet endurance. They knew arrogance always collapses. They could feel that his downfall was coming, and when it did, it would come not from the prosecutors or the judge, but from a place he never expected: his own blood. His sister had remained quiet until then, watching, waiting, but soon she would break the silence, and with her voice the mask he had clung to would shatter forever. When the defense called his sister to the stand, the courtroom expected sympathy. Perhaps she would describe a troubled childhood, a misunderstood brother, a boy who deserved compassion. Instead, what followed was the moment that broke everything. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. At first, her answers were simple: memories of growing up together, a vague description of family life. But Judge Judy's courtroom has a way of cutting through masks, and when the prosecutor began her cross-examination, the silence grew thick with anticipation. The questions were gentle, but relentless. Did she know about his spending? Had she seen his anger? Did she hear him the night Ella was killed? And then it came, the one question that could no longer be dodged. Where was your brother that night? Her lips quivered, tears running down her cheeks as she looked not at her brother but at the victim's family. He came to my room, she whispered, voice breaking. He said it was done, that she wouldn't be a problem anymore. And then he laughed. The words crashed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The teenager shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage, screaming at his sister, calling her a liar, a traitor. Bailiffs rushed to restrain him, but the damage was already done. His own blood had ripped away the mask, revealing him not as misunderstood, but as a predator who celebrated cruelty. If this shocking turn gave you chills, subscribe and comment exposed so I know you felt the weight of this moment. The moment his sister's words pierced the silence, the arrogance that had carried him through every stage of the trial began to rot from the inside out. His smirk was gone, replaced with a mask of unrestrained fury. He thrashed in his seat, shouting denials, his voice breaking with desperation rather than control. The boy who once laughed at a grieving mother was now screaming like a cornered animal, fighting not for freedom, but for the last shreds of his pride. Judge Judy's gavel thundered across the courtroom, her eyes colder than stone. She had warned him. She had watched his arrogance unfold piece by piece, and now she saw the collapse. You're finished, she declared, silencing his rage with the authority of a voice that could not be defied. For the jury, that was all they needed. His own sister had exposed him, and his own actions had confirmed the truth. He wasn't untouchable. He was unraveling. The family, who had endured his smirks and mockery, now sat with tears of relief. They had waited for this moment, for the arrogance to break, for the mask to shatter. And now it had. The predator had become pitiful, a spectacle of rage and fear. What he once thought made him powerful had only exposed how hollow he truly was. The courtroom had witnessed the transformation, from arrogant boy to broken fraud. The verdict was inevitable, but the collapse itself was the real judgment. The jury needed less than an hour. After days of evidence, after weeks of arrogance, the choice before them was no longer complicated. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, every breath held, every eye fixed on the foreperson. And then, in a voice that shook with the weight of justice, the word was spoken: guilty. The verdict rippled through the gallery like a wave of relief. The victim's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, tears streaming freely. Not tears of joy, because joy could never return, but tears of closure, of finality. They had endured the sneers, the cruel laughter, the yawn that mocked their grief. Now at last they saw the mask ripped away. Their daughter's memory had not been buried beneath his arrogance. Truth had prevailed. The killer sat motionless, his jaw clenched, his smirk threatening to return but unable to hold. For the first time, he wasn't directing the story. He wasn't in control. His sister's betrayal had stolen that power from him, and the jury's verdict had nailed shut the coffin of his arrogance. The boy who believed he was untouchable had been reduced to a criminal stripped of dignity, shackled not just by chains, but by the truth. Weeks later, the sentencing hearing brought the final confrontation. Judge Judy entered with her usual commanding presence, but her words that day carried more weight than any verdict. She spoke directly to him, her tone sharp with disdain. You thought cruelty was strength. You thought laughter could hide your guilt. But today, we see you for what you are. Not a misunderstood boy. Not a genius manipulator, but an empty shell filled with arrogance and greed. Her words cut deeper than any gavel. She reviewed the evidence with piercing clarity. The calculated fraud, the cold-blooded murder, the contempt for the family's grief, the sister's devastating testimony. Each fact was another nail sealing his fate. When she finally looked up, her eyes locked on him with unflinching resolve. You mocked a mother's tears, she said, her voice firm. But today, justice mocks you. The sentence was delivered. Life in prison without parole. A life stripped of freedom, stripped of applause, stripped of the audience he had always craved. He would no longer be the center of attention, except as a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance is not invincibility, and cruelty is not power. As bailiffs moved to take him away, he tried one last act of defiance. He stood, chains clinking, and stared at his sister in the gallery. His lips curled into a sneer, his eyes filled with venom. But it no longer mattered. His words had no power, his threats no weight. The courtroom didn't see a predator anymore. They saw a boy broken by his own arrogance, dragged from the room as his final performance collapsed into nothing. Outside, the family stood together in the cold air, not victorious, but steady. Justice had not erased their grief, but it had given their daughter dignity. They had faced down a boy who mocked their pain and left the courtroom knowing his laughter would echo only in the confines of a prison cell. And in the end, the story was no longer his. It belonged to them, the family who endured, the sister who spoke, and the judge who would not be mocked. His arrogance had been exposed for what it was, weakness dressed as strength. The mask had shattered and nothing remained but the truth. If this story struck you, subscribe and comment the word truth so I know its weight reached you.